Okay, everyone, we'll make a start. Thanks for joining the August instalment of our monthly seminar series. For those that don't know me, I'm Brendan Bradley, currently the director of QuakeCoRE. So it's great to be able to introduce this morning Emma from the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University, where she's a senior lecturer currently in the School of Psychology. Is going to be talking to us about the 2013 Cook Strait earthquake sequence. So Emma, hand over to you, and thanks very much in advance, and there's an opportunity for questions at the end as well. Okay. Thanks.
Hello all, hopefully you can hear me okay. If you can't hear us, let us know. I'm going to be talking to you about the motivations to prepare after the 2013 Cook Strait earthquake sequence. And this is work I've done with quite a large team of people. John McClure from Vic University, Sally Potter from GNS, Julia Becker here at Massey, David Johnston, Mike Lindell from Texas A&M University, Saab, who used to be at the JCDR, Stu Fraser, who was a PhD student but is now works in the UK, and Maureen Coomer over at GNS, and a wider team of people that were involved in delivering our surveys. So I want to thank them all up front. So just a little bit of an introduction to the SEDN survey. I think if you cast your mind back to 2013, it was quite an interesting sequence. We have had two earthquakes, a magnitude 5.7 and a 5.8, and then that was followed by two much larger earthquakes, the 6.5, which was the Cook Strait earthquake, and the 6.6, which was the Lake Grassmere earthquakes. And they're very interesting because it allowed us to explore the relationships between preparedness and experience and beliefs, given that there were two earthquakes within a month of each other. And a little snippet ahead of the rest of the talk, just to give you an idea, the main findings we really had was that the earthquake characteristics, the time and the location of the earthquake, significantly influenced the type of preparedness actions and were also influenced by gender. So a little bit of an intro. I'll go over some of the earthquake background, the associated studies and findings that were with this, because there was more than one study done on this survey, and some results and implications. And so as you can see, well, I think because of our little Zoom thing, you can't see on the far right-hand side, but you can see there was quite a bit of damage after the Cook Strait earthquake around the harbour region of Wellington. And you can see in the lower image the number of aftershocks that happened within that Cook Strait region. So what we have here is the level of shaking for the magnitude 6.5 Cook Strait earthquake on the left, and you have our survey regions, which I'll explain more in a minute. I don't know if I can. Oh yeah, our survey regions, which I'll explain more in a minute, we're in these southern suburbs here that are outlined. So that's the Cook Strait earthquake. So there's moderate shaking in Island Bay, in the kind of Lar Bay and in the city centre, and this was after the Lake Grassmere earthquake, similar levels of shaking, although there were more people in town, which I will explain shortly. So a bit of background, the earthquakes together caused over $30 million of insured damage. What was really interesting was that the first significant earthquake, the Cook Strait earthquake, occurred at just after 5 p.m. on a Sunday. Most people were at home with their families. I remember that well. I was in my room with the kids, and it was quite a shake. And the CBD was closed due to building damage for a couple of days afterwards. The second earthquake occurred at 2:31 on a Friday afternoon. Most people were at work, and this resulted in many people leaving the CBDs. People went out and stood on the streets, and there was confusion around whether you should evacuate or not from these tall high-rise buildings, which resulted in the REMO releasing and McDem releasing information about staying in the building. But yet when there were fire alarms going off, people were conflicted about whether they should stay in or out. And it also meant that many people ended up, there was an overload of transportation. And so we know that there were people that walked back to the hut, the trains were overloaded, people stayed with friends in town. It was pretty log jammed after that. So there were two earthquakes, and they were a month apart, and they had very different social situations. And so this makes a really interesting exploratory survey How do people's preparedness actions change, given we had these two quite different earthquakes? How did the timing and the characteristics influence the type of actions? And how did their levels of concern about future earthquakes relate to the actions taken? So a little bit of background around the key factors that can influence preparedness and resilience building. So there's been quite a lot of research in this area. I've listed across the top just a whole range of authors that have worked in this space. And the main things are your individual factors that influence whether or not people prepare for an earthquake. So that can be the self-efficacy, how likely they think that their actions are actually going to have an impact. Their outcome expectancy, whether it's going to be a good outcome, a bad outcome, their critical awareness, their action coping, their sense of place, and also their personal responsibility. There's also the community participation, so the community level and how well the community is at articulating problems, whether there's leadership, that level of collective action and collective cohesion, the social responsibility and place attachment. And then institutional, so that's around community empowerment and trust. And the important thing here is that they're all interdependent. And we know that experience influences preparedness because it can prompt thinking, raise awareness, build understanding and beliefs in preparedness, influence emotions and feelings, as well as prompting community interaction. But what we also know is that past experience can both enhance and also decrease risk perception and thus actions. So it can enhance risk perception because it can reduce people's level of uncertainty that an event might happen. And so they think it's more likely to happen. But it can also decrease risk perception because if it's not a particularly large event or similar, it can get a bit of what's called optimistic bias and feel like, oh, there's no point preparing, it's not going to be bad. So it can essentially it changes people's perceptions of their vulnerability. And that's quite important when we think about risk perception and actions. So the study design. As much as possible, we utilised existing questions from other surveys because it allows us to cross-compare between different events. So we included, and this was mainly related to some of Mike Lindell's work, behavioural response and emotional reactions to the 2011 Christchurch and the Japanese earthquake, the Great Tohoku earthquakes. Those survey questions were included. We included some survey questions from John McClure's work around earthquake preparations, what things people had to hand and took actions afterwards. Some work around aftershock communications, which relates to Julia Becker's and myself and Anne Wine at the USGS and Sarah McBride and Sally Potter's work. And then we also included some new additional questions on aftershock concern, as well as tsunami perception and tsunami evacuation response. And this has been reported in 3 separate surveys. Now, the reason we put all these surveys together was because after the Christchurch earthquakes, this community indicated that they felt they were being over-surveyed. And so we felt it was important to put it all into one survey. Now, obviously, this has negative aspects in the sense that it ends up with a very long survey and people might just drop out halfway through your survey. But we felt that that was still more beneficial than going to the same community with 3 surveys in a row. It also enables us to look at some of the cross elements between tsunami and actions and perceptions and look at some of these cross issues. I'm focusing on today the section on actions. The section on tsunami has been published and I've got a link to all these papers at the end of the talk. And that was published by Fraser et al., Stu Fraser. And some of the main findings that we kind of identified from there, which I just quickly highlight, was that while both earthquakes met the CDEM criteria for tsunami evacuation, most people didn't evacuate. And when we look at people's perceptions of the shaking and duration, their evacuation behaviours didn't match their perceptions of the shaking evacuation. And this is because most people overestimated the amount of time, the shaking duration. So it's really quite odd that they didn't then evacuate. So not only did it meet the criteria for evacuation, they also overestimated how long and how strong it was and still didn't evacuate. So there's a few interesting aspects there. One, we started to see something called time dilation, which was identified in some of the Christchurch earthquakes as well, where during an earthquake, people think it's occurring longer than it actually is. But also, why didn't people evacuate? And we need to try to understand that a little bit more. We did also identify that they had quite an accurate perception of their tsunami hazard zone, particularly in Island Bay, which I'll explain the areas in a minute, but Island Bay and the southern suburbs have the tsunami blue lines, and so people are very aware of where their tsunami zone ends because they drive across these tsunami safe zones on a daily basis. But they actually had a very poor perception of what a likely tsunami impact would be and how it would impact them and their ability to go about things. So it highlighted some, in particular, it highlighted that even though these would be considered to be small impact events, it's important to do research on these small impact events as much as the big impact events, because these small impact events lead us to build an understanding of what people's perceptions are prior to those big impact events. And the third study is on aftershock communications, which is still being analysed at the moment. And so hopefully there'll be a paper out fairly soon. So for the actions, I won't go into the survey questions too much, but I just wanted to give you an essence of what they included. So we included questions on the shaking and the how long they felt the shaking and how severe they felt the shaking. We included questions about their perceptions, their beliefs about what would happen. So did they think that the building they were in would be destroyed? Did they think family would be injured? Did they think there'd be disruption to electrical, telephone? Did they think they wouldn't be able to work? We then asked them what supplies they had at the time of the earthquake, so water, emergency plans, what kind of impacts they had, if anyone was injured, how much damage it did to their home, what infrastructure was interrupted. After the earthquake, what kind of actions did they take? Did they get basic needs? Did they get basic equipment? Did they make logistics planning? Did they quake safe their homes? Stuff like that. Then we also asked some concern questions. How concerned were they about a damaging aftershock or earthquake in the Wellington region in that week after the Cook Strait earthquake? And then thinking about the future, how concerned were they about future earthquakes? So we delivered 600 surveys by hand on the 30th and 31st of October. So it was a couple of months after so there is a bit of a time delay after the second earthquake. And that's why we had such a team of people to thank, because there were a lot of people that went out on a pretty rainy, windy day to deliver these surveys. Fortunately, none were blown away. You were there, yeah, we had quite a team. We had chosen their location based upon whether they were in or out of the tsunami zone. And that was because of the tsunami part of our study, and picked a number of streets and then did alternate letterbox drops. So every other house got a survey. Reminders were sent out in December, and they were accepted until 10th of January. They were anonymous, but yet they were geolocated. So there was an anonymous code associated with, so we could geolocate some of the answers, but they were kept anonymous in terms of confidentiality. There were 204 responses with a 34% response rate, which is actually quite high for a paper delivery survey like this. It might not seem very high, 34%, but that is actually quite good. And it was all analysed via SPSS statistically. So locations of respondents at the time of the earthquake. Unfortunately, I don't think people can see the right-hand side of the table, but I can explain it to you. They were, the majority of people for the Cook Strait earthquake were in, can I move that? Okay. Can you see the right-hand side of this table, people? Oh, yes, you can.
Yeah, we can see it.
Cool. So in the island, for the first earthquake, the Cook Strait earthquake, the majority of people were down here in Island Bay and in these southern suburbs. For the Lake Grassmere earthquake, the majority of people were in here, in the CBD, in the Thorndon areas, and some people were in Newtown and stuff like that. Now, just a little, this is the tsunami evacuation zone map, just to give you an idea for Wellington region. So in terms of the demographics, it's quite important to just recap the demographics. The mean age was just shy of 50 years, mostly female, 65% female, mostly European, mostly employed, mostly had a household income over 50K, most owned their home, so it's 81%, and most had a tertiary education. And this is important because we have close to the New Zealand stats average for ethnicity, but our sample significantly overrepresents older female homeowners with a high education and a high income. So it's a fairly affluent suburb, and so that does influence how we understand the actions that were taken. So actions that were taken is that primarily more people, considering all participants, significantly more people took action after the first Cook Strait earthquake than the Lake Grassmere. And we did some chi-square tests to look at that. So what we have in the table here is we have that first little foreshock that happened on a Friday morning, and then another one on the Sunday morning, then the Cook Strait earthquake on the Sunday afternoon, and then the Lake Grassmere earthquake on the Friday afternoon. So more people took actions after Cook Strait. But what's quite interesting is that there's a bit of difference in what actions they took. But the majority of the time they took damage mitigations and basic supplies for the Cook Strait. So we can drill down a little bit more into which actions were taken after which earthquake, because this is the raw number of people who were present in the region, but not considering people that, this is all the people present for each earthquake. And then if we look at what actions were taken for people that were present in both earthquakes, we start to get some interesting findings. So if you compare the actions to their existing supplies, for both earthquakes, people were prompted to make new preparations. So compared to what they already had, they went out and got more supplies. And they were also prompted to take action previously to review or enhance their existing preparations. Whoops. Of those who got basic, so for example, of those who got basic supplies, 44% didn't have water, 28% didn't have food, and 42% didn't have an emergency management kit. But then the corresponding view of that is that 56% did have water, and they did have, 72 did have food. And we find this the same with the logistics actions and stuff. So not only are people making new preparations, but a bunch of people are reviewing what they already have. So, as I was saying, those previous statistics were looking at everyone that responded to the survey. But when we look at those who were only present during both earthquakes, we get to see some interesting aspects. So firstly, there was a decrease in participants taking any of the 4 actions from Cook Strait to Lake Grassmere. And you would kind of expect that in the sense that if they've already prepared themselves in Cook Strait, they don't need to in Lake Grassmere. So 47 people took action in both, 56 took action in neither, 36 only after Cook Strait, and 13 only after Lake Grassmere. More people overall got basic supplies after Cook Strait and basic equipment and damage mitigation. So after Cook Strait, most people concentrated on their supplies, their equipment, and their safety in terms of their building safety. However, after Lake Grassmere, a slightly higher relative number took more logistics actions. So they focused on the logistics actions. And this reflects the impacts of each earthquake, essentially. So if you remember that Lake Grassmere earthquake was when everyone was in town and the CBD. So we also looked at the beliefs of people, the beliefs that the building they were in would be damaged, the home damage, job disruption. And what we see here is that for the Lake Grassmere earthquake, significantly more people expected to have job disruption and electrical service telephone interruption. So that's the Friday afternoon earthquake. So in Cook Strait, people expected service and communication interruption, but in Lake Grassmere, people expected more disruption to job communications, and also that the building in, I forgot to say that, the building in would be damaged. So remember, most of the participants were in tower blocks in the centre of the CBD. So considering belief, there was a higher belief in Lake Grassmere that the building in would be damaged and that family members would be injured and job disrupted. So what does this mean? It implies that the participants felt their homes were safer than workplaces and schools, and that they were more concerned about injury to family when they were apart from them, and that earthquake would be more impactful on their job when they were at work, which kind of makes sense. So I realised that there's actually not, I don't want to go into too much depth here because of time, but when we think about the beliefs versus actions, we can run some t-tests and some statistical tests looking at how the beliefs compared to actions. So for Cook Strait, people were more likely to review their logistics if they expected their job would be disrupted. And then in Lake Grassmere, any of the 5 beliefs that they had were more likely to review logistics and take action around kind of family liaising, essentially. So this implies that reviewing logistics was related more to impact beliefs for Lake Grassmere than Cook Strait, and that the beliefs about electrical, telephone and service interruption influenced actions after Lake Grassmere more. Now, of course, if we think about the Lake Grassmere event happening on a Friday afternoon, it did impact communication and travels more. Next, we can briefly think about concern. So what we have here in this graph, the pale grey is the immediate aftershock concern, and the dark grey is the future concern. And we found that there was a higher concern about immediate aftershocks, and this significantly, through statistical tests, relates to taking more actions. And the future concern about future earthquakes was lower than their immediate aftershock concern. The higher future concern after Cook Strait significantly relates to logistics, but not to other actions. We can also look at demographics. So one of the things we found was that for gender, females took more preparedness actions in Cook Strait and of any of the preparedness actions, and after Lake Grassmere, females reviewed logistics more and took more damage mitigation. Education, there was a significant association with higher education with taking any action for Lake Grassmere. So a greater proportion of people with trade or university qualifications versus secondary or no qualifications took action. Ethnicity, we found no significant relationship between action and ethnicity, but I want to highlight that this was quite a skewed population sample, and so that probably reflects the sample distribution more than anything. And age, there was a significant association between age after actions. Younger adults took more actions, essentially. Concern, females reported higher levels of concern for Cook Strait, but not for Lake Grassmere. And age, significant association between age. Older adults had lower levels of concern. Younger adults had higher levels of concern. No relationship between education or ethnicity and concern. So what does this all mean, essentially? Firstly, the specific earthquake characteristics. So that's the time of day, the location, and the impacts or perceived impacts to family and home influences the type of preparedness actions that are taken. But we saw a decrease in some of the preparedness actions from Cook Strait to Lake Grassmere. So was that because they believed they had taken sufficient action? We saw an increase in reviewing logistics after Lake Grassmere, and that's probably because it was most influenced by the characteristics of the earthquake and the impact beliefs. And that ties into the participants feeling safer at home than at work and more concerned about family members when they're apart during the day. So we can also look into some of the free response questions that participants provided, and this really emphasises that point. So for example, some participants said, it was very unnerving to be away from my local area and home. I'm always conscious of having good walking shoes with me at all times. Keep my shoes by my bed at night. Scary driving through town to get home. Or I was more concerned for my household members after the Friday 16th afternoon earthquake. So that's the one that was where most people were in town, because I couldn't contact them. I was surprised at how different the experience can be depending upon where you are when it happens. I was surprised at how jammed the telephones were after the second earthquake. I didn't like it. Having my husband work in the CBD, I'm 100% worried and fearful for his life should a seriously big one strike while he is at work. And the Friday the 16th August series of earthquakes were considerably scarier, especially on the 7th floor of our building. Though workplace is very new and cope with the earthquake really well, I must get my chimneys and piles looked at in my house. So a larger proportion of participants were prompted to review or enhance existing preparations rather than take new preparation actions. So what are the implications for that on risk messaging? So if we're thinking about the kind of messages we can send out prior to and after an earthquake to get people to prepare, what does this all mean for that? What we have found is that in our case, repeated earthquakes encourage review of preparedness rather than encouraging new actions. So people's experience of 2 earthquakes in a row made them review their preparedness actions. The type of action depended on the earthquake context. So if we think back to the literature, that falls into the idea of it being a problem-focused action that they've taken. They were motivated by a reduction in optimistic bias to either a reduction in optimistic bias to an impact, i.e. they may have been motivated by the fact that they kind of thought, oh, actually, this is more likely to happen than I thought it was, or by a change in risk perception due to their experience. And because females took more actions than men and reported higher concern, that's quite interesting. And we can look into the literature there and try and understand that. And people have looked at this and they've identified that the reason females take more actions after earthquakes and prior to other events such as hurricanes and other significant events is because of the socially constructed gender differences we have in caregiving roles. So essentially, the traditional, let's say, old-fashioned approach of, the woman at home with the family, men goes to work. Those are caregiving roles means that that might actually be skewing their risk perception and actions. However, what's really interesting is some research has been done where they have both members of the family working, equal job, equal responsibility in the family, but yet the female still had higher risk concern and still took more actions. And they correlate this to the cultural gender roles that we've created around responsibility for others. And so it'd be interesting to see how that evolves through time. So a few take-home messages. As I said, this was an exploratory survey. These 2 earthquakes happened and we thought, right, let's get some quick data around this in terms of, and capture this data before it gets too old. And so now we need to be thinking about doing some more empirical designed surveys and experiments to kind of understand these issues a bit more. So one issue would be, if people are more likely to review actions and it's correlated with the aspect that caused them the most concern, should we develop our action messaging post-event to match what has caused them the highest concern? So if people are concerned about their logistics, and we know that they're concerned about their logistics, should we be messaging them around logistics and kind of capture that interest because they're interested about it? To do that would require some form of assessment immediately after an event to identify what people's key concerns are. Or, counterintuitive, should we actually do the opposite? If people are already interested in logistics and they're going to focus all their energy on logistics, should we actually write some targeted action messaging that says, hey, don't forget about your chimney, don't forget, we know that you're worried about logistics, but remember you need to secure your chimney or remove your chimney, you need to think about your foundations. So, because people are already acting on these concerns. So that's a key future research area that we need to be thinking about. We also found that because people's concern was highest immediately after the first earthquake, this represents quite a limited time window with which to get these messaging actions out. And this work has also been found by other people like John McClure, when they've looked at people's perceptions of risk and aftershock concern, and some of our other work around aftershock zones. There's a limited time window where you can get some of these preparedness messaging out. And so we don't need to be doing it 3 months down the line. We need to be concentrating on those first few weeks because while it's still front and center of people's thinking. So I just want to highlight that obviously there are some limitations with this research. It was an exploratory research. It was very much done in order to capture and just explore stuff. And so that's why we need to be thinking about doing some more empirically designed research in the future. Surveys like this that are done after an event are always going to be subject to hindsight bias. So people misremembering the duration or the length or quite what they did. We asked people, in our survey, we asked the person with the birthday, the most recent birthday, to respond to the survey, and they're responding on the behalf of their household. So when we think about concern, there's some issues there with, was it their concern or was it their household concern? Surveys like this on preparedness also suffer from something called social desirability bias. And essentially what that means is that people don't tell the 100% truth when they're filling out these surveys, because they respond with what they think they should be saying. So if they think they should be prepared, they want to comply to the social norms, so they might say that they're more prepared than they are. And this is a real issue with our preparedness surveys, and a lot of this data is how do we make sure that what people are, and any kind of survey, to be honest, how do we make sure that it's a true reflection? Because people want to do well, so they may actually skew their responses a little bit. And finally, as I said earlier, our sample does represent a disproportionately educated and affluent group, which research has shown is probably going to bias them towards increased risk perception and ability to prepare. And Denise Blake, one of our colleagues, has really highlighted that how, you know, preparedness may be limited by our financial constraints, lack of social capital, lack of connections and capacity and support. And other research has highlighted how social vulnerability, social economic status, and lack of social capital, lower education, can create barriers to preparedness. So that's all I have to say for now. As I said, this was a kind of interesting window and opportunity to collect some data with 2 earthquakes. And we've identified some really interesting questions, essentially, that have come from the data, and some areas that require further research. If you go to that URL up there, you can find these papers, or you can email me any other questions. These are the papers, and obviously I've been supported by funding by the EQC and GNS, as well as the National, the Resilience to Nature's Challenges programme. And down at the bottom there, which I noticed we don't have your name, Carol.
It was mine, it's fine.
Some of the people that helped us with the survey delivery. And that's all. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Emma. Opportunity for anyone on the line to offer any questions. Just remember to unmute your microphone as you do so.
Emma, it's Caroline here. Sorry,
Hi,
I arrived a little bit late, so I might have missed something, but my question was about people's preference to be at home rather than at work, and you suggested it might be something to do with their feeling of safety. Yeah. I wonder if there was something more about just the fact that they preferred to be at home because then they were more likely to be with their families and in their comfortable surroundings.
Yes, definitely. So that they had higher concern, their beliefs, they had higher concern and beliefs around family issues when they were in town, about being essentially higher beliefs that their family would be injured for the Friday afternoon earthquake. Whereas the Sunday afternoon earthquake, they had lower beliefs of that. So I think that's absolutely key, is that they were with their families at home, and so they were, that's that feeling of safety, not just the building, but they know where their children and their husbands and their partners and wives are, essentially. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
I've got one. Carol Stewart here. So I think you said that the survey population was not representative of the New Zealand general population, but are they representative of the item of, you know, of the local population?
Yes.
Because we know they're affluent suburbs.
Yeah, yeah. So they were they very much matched the population of those suburbs. So they didn't match the New Zealand population.
Right.
They closely did for ethnicity, but not for the other, not for kind of the affluence and the education. But they did quite closely match Wellington. Wellington as a whole is quite an affluent, kind of South, Thorndon South is quite an affluent, educated suburb, the community essentially.
So in that sense, they may be quite a good reflection of, you know, the attitudes and preparedness of the Wellington population.
Yes, yeah, I would have thought so. Yeah, I think it would probably match quite well the behaviours of people in those southern suburbs up to kind of the CBD essentially. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for the presentation. It was great. A reminder to people that some reasonable time after these presentations, we do put them on the QuakeCoRE YouTube page, so you are able to view them afterwards. We won't have a monthly seminar next month because we have the QuakeCoRE annual meeting, so look forward to seeing many of you in Nelson, and then we'll resume our subsequent monthly seminar series in August. So, until then, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you then.